I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw a strange SUV sitting in my garage like it owned the place. It wasn't my sister's car, it wasn't my neighbor's, and it sure as hell wasn't mine. The worst part? The garage door was wide open, as if the universe was showing me the absurdity of the situation in broad daylight. I had been gone for barely 8 hours, and in that short time, someone had claimed my property like a lion marking its territory. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Some delivery guy using my space to turn around, maybe a confused Uber driver. But when I stepped out of my car and got a better look, my gut told me this was something else entirely. The car was parked perfectly inside as if the driver had taken their sweet time getting it just right. The door was locked, and to make things even weirder, there was a half-empty iced coffee on the hood, the condensation still fresh, meaning someone had been here recently. I marched up to my front door, checked to make sure nothing else had been tampered with, then went straight to the neighbors. That's when I met her. Karen. She appeared before I even knocked, stepping out of her house with the kind of confidence that only comes with a lifetime of getting away with nonsense. Short bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, and an expression that screamed, "I dare you to challenge me." "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my tone level. "Do you know whose car that is in my garage?" She didn't even hesitate. "Yeah, it's mine." Silence. I blinked. She sipped her drink. "I'm sorry, what?" "I parked there," she repeated as if that somehow cleared everything up. I laughed, waiting for her to tell me she was joking, but she just stared at me like I was the one being unreasonable. "So you just parked in my garage?" I asked, making sure I wasn't hallucinating. She scoffed. "It was empty. What's the big deal? You weren't even using it." Oh, this was going to be a problem. I took a deep breath, gripping the bridge of my nose to keep myself from losing it. "Karen, this is my property. You can't just park in my garage because you feel like it." She rolled her eyes. "Well, I was in a hurry and your driveway was too sloped for my SUV. You have so much space, and I figured since you weren't home." What's the harm? The sheer audacity almost made me laugh. Almost. "The harm is that it's illegal," I said, my patience thinning. "You're trespassing. Move your car." She crossed her arms. "I will, but I have errands to run, so I'll get to it later." "Later," I repeated, now actually laughing in disbelief. You'll move it now." Karen let out an exaggerated sigh, like I was some unreasonable landlord asking for rent on time. "I can't. I'm going out with my friends. Just be a good neighbor and let it be." And with that, she turned and walked back into her house, shutting the door in my face. I stood there, jaw clenched, trying to process what had just happened. I had met my fair share of entitled people, but Karen was operating on a whole different level. I could have called the police. I could have had her towed. But something about her smug little smirk as she dismissed me ignited a much pettier fire inside me. Fine. She wanted to park in my garage so badly? She could stay in my garage. Without hesitation, I walked back to my house, grabbed the garage door remote, and manually locked it from the inside. Then I secured the side door with the deadbolt, checked everything twice, and made sure there was no way in or out. And then I packed my bags and left. For a week. Now here's where things got really interesting. What I didn't know at the time was that Karen had gone into the garage before I locked it. She must have gone back to grab something from her car, assuming she could come and go as she pleased. But with the door locked and no way to open it from the inside without the remote, she was trapped. By the time I was halfway to my vacation destination, sipping a drink in the sun, Karen was stuck in my garage with nothing but her purse and the contents of her car to keep her company. Back home, the neighborhood was beginning to notice her absence. Her husband, Greg, seemed vaguely concerned but mostly indifferent. I later found out that he had assumed she went on a shopping trip or a girl's getaway. But Susan, her best friend and fellow drama queen, started raising questions. Meanwhile, inside the garage, Karen was discovering just how limited her options were. She had no phone signal, no food except for some stale protein bars I had forgotten about, and worst of all, no working restroom. She pounded on the walls, screamed for help, and even tried to pick the lock with a bobby pin. But the garage door remained stubbornly shut. By day 3, she was desperate. She tried everything. banging on the walls at night, honking the horn, even attempting to squeeze through the doggy door in a move so ridiculous I wish I had security footage of it. Meanwhile, I was blissfully unaware, enjoying my trip with zero interruptions, until I got a message from an unknown number. "Help me, you monster!" I stared at the screen, confused. Then another message popped up. "You locked me in, you psychopath. Let me out." And that's when I realized what had happened. Karen hadn't just parked in my garage. She had parked herself in my garage. And now she wanted out. But I wasn't in any rush to fix her problem. After all, hadn't she told me to be a good neighbor and let her park there? I smirked, put my phone away, and ordered another drink. Karen could wait. By the second day, Karen had gone through every possible emotion: anger, denial, bargaining, and full-blown desperation. She had screamed, kicked the walls, honked the car horn so many times that the battery was nearly dead, and even banged on the garage door with a tire iron she found in the trunk. But nothing worked. The garage door was locked tight, and no one had come to her rescue. At first, she had convinced herself that someone would hear her. After all, she was Karen, and Karen always got her way. Surely a neighbor would notice her absence. Maybe Greg would realize something was off and come looking for her. But as the hours passed, reality set in. Greg wasn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed, and honestly, he was probably enjoying the silence. The neighbors? They didn't like her enough to be concerned. The only person who could fix this was me, and I was sipping margaritas somewhere far away, completely unaware. Or worse, fully aware. She had to survive. The first challenge was food and water. A quick search through her purse revealed some breath mints, a crumpled granola bar wrapper that had nothing but crumbs, and a half-full bottle of overpriced alkaline water. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. She scoured the car next, rummaging through the glove compartment and center console like a raccoon digging through trash. Jackpot, a pack of stale crackers, a melted chocolate bar, an old energy drink. It wasn't exactly a gourmet meal, but it was better than nothing. The bathroom situation, however, was a different nightmare entirely. After holding it in as long as she could, she finally gave up and had to resort to an empty Starbucks cup in the back seat. It was humiliating, disgusting, and something she would never, ever speak of again. She swore that the moment she got out of here, she would sue me into oblivion. She would make sure I regretted ever messing with her. By day 3, she was starting to lose it. The walls of the garage felt like they were closing in. The air smelled like a mix of car exhaust and desperation, and she had spent too much time arguing with herself. She tried sleeping, but the car seats were uncomfortable, and the sound of absolute silence was unnerving. Every creak, every distant dog bark, every car passing by outside made her heart race. She would have given anything for her phone, but the signal was non-existent in the garage, and her battery had died anyway. At one point, she got the brilliant idea to escape through the doggy door on the side entrance. It was a small flap meant for a golden retriever, not a fully grown woman, but she was desperate enough to try. She got on her stomach, wiggled forward, and managed to squeeze her head through. The rest of her, however, was not cooperating. Her shoulders were too broad, her hips refused to budge, and she was now stuck, halfway in and halfway out, like a pathetic cartoon character. It took her 20 minutes of struggling, screaming, and pure humiliation before she finally managed to pull herself back inside. She was reaching her breaking point. Meanwhile, back in the real world, things were beginning to get suspicious. Karen's best friend Susan had started asking around. Greg, who had enjoyed a few blissful days of quiet, was beginning to notice that his wife hadn't texted him in a while. He had assumed she was out shopping or at a spa day. But when Susan called him for the 4th time, suggesting something might actually be wrong, even he had to admit, it was a little odd. Greg eventually wandered over to my house, knocking on the door. When there was no answer, he peeked around the property, checking to see if Karen's car was still parked somewhere. The garage was locked tight, and without any obvious sign of his wife, Greg shrugged and went home. If she was in trouble, she would have found a way to make sure everyone knew about it. Back in the garage, Karen was now at the stage of insanity where she started talking to objects. The iced coffee cup from earlier? It had become Wilson. her only companion. She had full conversations with it, blaming me for her predicament, blaming Greg for not realizing she was missing, blaming the universe for allowing this to happen to someone as important as her. Wilson, of course, had no response, which only made her angrier. Then in a moment of desperation, she remembered something. The garage had one tiny window near the ceiling. It wasn't big enough to climb through, but maybe, just maybe, she could get someone's attention. Stacking whatever she could find, she climbed onto the hood of her car, then onto the roof, and finally reached the window. She could see the street outside. Freedom was so close, yet so far. She screamed for help, waving her arms like a madwoman, but no one was around. The only person who did walk by, Mr. Jenkins, the elderly neighbor who always wore noise-canceling headphones when he went on his daily walk. He didn't even glance in her direction. Her last hope was honking the horn again, but after draining the car battery earlier, that was no longer an option. She was stuck, defeated, trapped in a garage that, until recently, she had thought of as her personal parking space. And then, just when she had finally accepted her fate, she heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone pulling into the driveway. Her heart leapt. Finally, someone had come to save her. But the second she saw who it was, her relief turned into pure, unfiltered rage. It was me. The garage door started to open, flooding the space with fresh air and sunlight. And the second it was high enough, Karen exploded out like a bat out of hell, wild-eyed, furious, and ready to unleash every ounce of pent-up frustration. I, on the other hand, I just stood there, calm, relaxed, sipping my iced coffee like I hadn't just left her to rot in a garage for a week. "You absolute psychopath," Karen screeched, her voice hoarse from days of shouting inside the enclosed space. "You locked me in there. You left me to rot. Do you have any idea what I've been through?" I raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "I mean, I assumed you'd move your car when I told you to." I took another slow sip of my drink. "Guess that didn't happen." Karen's hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She was dirty, exhausted, dehydrated, and beyond humiliated. The smell of stale energy drinks and desperation clung to her. Her once perfectly straightened bob, now frizzed beyond recognition. She had spent days plotting her revenge, fantasizing about every possible way to make me suffer for what I had done. And now that she was finally free, she was going to make sure I regretted it. "I'm calling the cops," she seethed, jabbing a trembling finger in my direction. "You're going to jail for this. This is unlawful imprisonment. I hope you have a good lawyer because you're done." I took another slow sip of my drink. "Go ahead." Karen faltered for a second. I wasn't panicked. I wasn't even remotely worried. I just pulled my phone out of my pocket and unlocked it. "Want me to call for you? Or do you want to use mine since your battery is probably dead?" For a split second, Karen hesitated. Something was off. Why wasn't I afraid? Why wasn't I scrambling to explain myself? The way I was looking at her, calm and composed, made her stomach twist with unease. Before she could respond, I walked over to my car and popped open the trunk. I pulled out a small security camera and tapped the screen. "See, the funny thing is," I continued, completely ignoring the way Karen looked like she was about to explode, "I installed cameras around my property a while ago." I held up the screen, letting the footage play. There she was, strutting up my driveway, waving her hand dismissively when I told her to move her car. There she was, arrogantly turning her back on me, saying she'd move it when she felt like it. And then the cherry on top. There she was, sneaking into the garage for something from her car just before I locked it and left. I grinned. "So technically, you locked yourself in. I just didn't know you were still inside when I left." Karen's lips parted, searching for some kind of argument, but nothing came. I had proof. Evidence. Her entire case crumbled in an instant, but I wasn't done yet. "Please," I said, slipping my phone back into my pocket. "Call the cops. I'd love to show them this." I tilted my head slightly. "I'm sure they'd be very interested in hearing how you trespassed on my property, parked in my garage without permission, refused to leave, and then accidentally got yourself stuck." I shrugged. "I think the legal term for that is breaking and entering." But what do I know? I'm not a lawyer. Karen's face burned. This, this wasn't how this was supposed to go. She was supposed to be the victim here, the one calling the shots, the one making me grovel for forgiveness. But now, not only was her entire argument turned against her, she was dangerously close to being the one in legal trouble. She needed to regain control. You can't prove that I was in there for a whole week, she spat. For all anyone knows, I was only in there for a few hours. I smirked. You mean, aside from the text you sent me? Karen froze. I unlocked my phone again, scrolled through my messages and held up the screen. Her frantic messages flashed in front of her. Help me, you monster. You locked me in, you psychopath. Let me out. I've been here for days. I'm losing my mind. I raised my eyebrows. Doesn't exactly sound like someone who was in there for a few hours, does it? Karen clenched her teeth so hard her jaw ached. She could feel her control slipping through her fingers like sand, and she hated it. And then, to make matters worse, her husband Greg finally decided to show up. He pulled into the driveway, stepping out of the car with a confused expression. Hey, babe, he frowned. Where have you been? Susan said she hasn't heard from you in days. Karen whipped around, barely holding herself together. Greg, this lunatic locked me in his garage for a week. Greg looked at me, then at the security camera in my hand, then back at Karen. Wait, so you were in his garage? He scratched his head. Why? Karen's mouth opened, then closed. That's not the point, Greg. Greg rubbed the back of his neck. So, why did you park in his garage? Karen's face twitched. She was ready to scream. This was humiliating. She had spent days suffering, expecting everyone to be on her side the second she got out. And now, her own husband was questioning her. I clapped my hands together. All right, well, I'm not going to press charges, I said, but I will be installing a new security system to make sure this never happens again. Karen scoffed. Like I would ever park in your garage again, you lunatic? I grinned. Good. Then we're on the same page. Karen seethed, feeling utterly defeated. This wasn't over. She would find a way to get back at me. She had to. But then, as if the universe wanted to deliver one final blow, her phone buzzed with a notification. A fine, a hefty one, from the Homeowners Association. The message was clear. Unauthorized use of another resident's property. Multiple complaints from neighbors. Decision from the HOA. Community privileges revoked for 1 full year. No pool access, no clubhouse reservations, nothing. I gave her a little salute. See you around, Karen. Karen wanted to scream. She wanted to fight, but there was nothing left to do. With no other choice, she stomped back to Greg's car, humiliated beyond belief. Greg, meanwhile, just sighed. So, should I even ask? Drive, Karen snapped, crossing her arms. And with that, Greg put the car in reverse and drove them away. I watched them go, then turned back to my garage, shaking my head in amusement. I had won. And the best part? Karen had done it to herself. For the first time in what felt like ages, my garage was mine again. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The wide open space, the peaceful quiet, the lack of entitled Karens trespassing on my property. It was glorious. I took a deep breath, then walked over to the garage door remote and tested it. Perfect. Nice and secure. No more unexpected visitors. And just for good measure, I went ahead and installed a new security system. Motion sensors, keypad entry, and a beautiful state-of-the-art surveillance camera pointed directly at my driveway. Because if there was one thing I had learned from this whole mess, it was that some people need to be reminded, forcefully, that rules exist for a reason. Karen, however, had a much harder time recovering from her week-long imprisonment. For days, she avoided eye contact with me. For weeks, she refused to take her usual morning walks around the neighborhood, probably because the neighbors wouldn't stop talking about it. And for months, she acted like none of it had ever happened, which was fine by me. The HOA fine hit her hard. The revoked community privileges hit her even harder. No more pool days, no more clubhouse events, no more exclusive neighborhood perks. And Greg, well, let's just say he really enjoyed the peace and quiet while she was gone. I'm not saying it put a permanent dent in their marriage, but the fact that he didn't bother searching for her for a whole week, yeah, that probably didn't help. A few months later, I overheard Karen ranting to Susan about how she was considering moving to a better neighborhood, one that wasn't full of jerks, one where people actually respected each other. The irony was delicious, because as far as I was concerned, I had done exactly what she asked. I had been a good neighbor, and I had let her park there for a whole week. I don't think she appreciated the favor. The lesson. At the end of the day, this wasn't just a story about some entitled woman who thought she could park in my garage. This was a story about consequences. Because here's the thing, Karen was so used to getting her way, so accustomed to steamrolling over people, that she never even considered the possibility that someone might push back. She had lived her entire life with the belief that if she complained enough, if she acted confident enough, if she made enough of a fuss, people would just let her do whatever she wanted. But not this time. Because when you take advantage of people, when you ignore basic respect and boundaries, when you think you can do whatever you want with no consequences, eventually the world will remind you who's really in charge. And sometimes, that reminder comes in the form of a locked garage door and a week of stale protein bars. So if there's one lesson to take away from this story, it's this. Don't be a Karen, or you just might end up trapped in someone else's garage.